Welcome, everyone, to tonight's Conversation and Coffee with the Lake Huron Basin team. We're super excited to talk fish with all of you today. My name is Megan Goss, and I will be helping facilitate this evening. I serve as a Michigan Sea Grant Extension educator in the Saginaw Bay region, and we're really excited to talk fish with all of you during this virtual Conversations and Coffee. So as we begin today, we wanted to collectively acknowledge that the lands we occupy in Michigan are the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Three Fires Confederacy of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the organization I work for, MSU, resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We highlight this and offer this land acknowledgement as we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, and we work to be more accountable to the needs of American Indians and Indigenous peoples. Also want to highlight that MSU is an affirmative action equal opportunity employer. And while our mandate is to ensure that all of our programs are open to all, this is also our goal as a program to ensure that we are meeting the needs of our communities. So as you registered for this event, you may have completed an optional demographic form. So we appreciate that as you help us to ensure that our programs are reaching the communities we serve across Michigan. And then just wanted to highlight some of the partners that are here on the call. Like I mentioned earlier, Michigan Sea Grant is helping to facilitate today's meeting, and Brandon Schroeder along with Cindy Hudson are both here helping with this meeting. And then we also wanted to highlight, in case you have not participated in them in the past, our Lake Huron fisheries workshops. From the registration, there were some questions that will have been answered in these workshops. So wanted to highlight these agendas. This was from the open water fisheries workshop. And this recording is available on our Michigan Sea Grant YouTube page. And we will share this link in the chat. And then we also last week had our nearshore fisheries workshop where we focused on Saginaw Bay and Lachino Islands, and lots of different updates, including a double-crested cormorant management update. So there will be additional information available there. So while we might not be able to address all the questions today, some of them have been addressed in those meetings. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our Michigan DNR partners to share more about the Conversations and Coffee.
Thanks, Megan. Really appreciate that intro. Glad to see everybody joining, and I want to reiterate a few points that Megan said. And the first one is, this is really meant to be a conversation. So in the event that you have a question, raise your hand, then Megan or the other Sea Grant facilitators will be able to unmute you, and you can speak with us directly, or you can put that comment in the chat or question. We will address any questions that are raised today, and looking forward to them. But why have this conversation coffee in the first place? As Megan pointed out, we've had, this is the third Thursday in a row where we've had a workshop focused on Lake Huron. So what's different about this one, and why do we need it? This one, the idea behind the Conversations of Coffee is we're actually trying to fulfill a mandate from the NRC. And the mandate is, addresses the idea that one of our tools in our management toolbox are regulations. But regulations can be very complicated sometimes. Over time, they can get more complex. And when changes come, stakeholders or anglers are caught off guard about some of the regulations, either the biology behind it or the social behind it, or what goals are we trying to achieve with the regulations. So the NRC asked a few years ago if we could have these meetings, host these for any regulatory changes across the DNR. And I remember distinctly the first one I went to, and it was 5 people and 5 DNR staff. And to think about the effectiveness of a meeting and trying to meet the needs in terms of updating people on regulatory changes, it didn't seem like we were kind of hitting the mark. And that's where I've got to really take my hat off to and give a lot of thanks and appreciation to Michigan Sea Grant, who've not only linked our fishery workshops or their fishery workshops, which brings a lot of information about the status of the fishery, but linked it with this conversation that also talks about, well, then what tools do we have to try to manage those fisheries And let's have a dialogue about those, both in terms of our current regulations, the changes that you're going to see in the guidebook today, outlined in red, or future changes, whether that be next year or even longer term in terms of trying to strategically manage our fishery that's for the betterment of the resource and the user. So when you look at these meetings, it's having the conversation about that important management tool, regulations. And the nice thing about the guide now is it's both printed and available online. The links were provided in your meeting information, but also if you look on page 2, anywhere in red in the guide is a change that was made from last year. So if you're worried, oh, I always fish for certain species on a certain water body, and do I have to check the guidebook or try to read between the lines to figure out, am I legal or not legal? If there were changes from last year, it's in red font and red text throughout, and you'll be able to see those changes. So that's something we've done as part of these conversations of coffee and really helped people understand if, again, we're trying to make the regulations as simple, as effective as possible. So you go to the next slide then, Megan, what you'll see as we kind of walk through this is that these regulations come from a lot of input from our local units, our field biologists and staff, up to the unit managers. So oftentimes we might be talking about a regulation and it was an idea that came out of a citizens advisory committee or a stakeholder or an average angler approaching one of our biologists to say, hey, I've got an issue, or I think we could do better in a certain water body. Our unit, our basin's divided into 2 sections, a northern Lake Huron, which Dave Borgeson is unit manager, Tim Slinsky and Neil Godby are the biologists. And then our southern unit, which is unit manager is Jeff Jolly, and the 2 biologists are Addie Dutton and Jason Gosto. So they're going to be on the call today, ready to field questions. I don't know if I saw a hand or not, but if there was a hand raised, Megan, feel free to jump in. But they're going to be on the call as well. So if you have, I see Dan saying, yep, he's good. If you have a question specific about, say, muskie in the Tittabawassee River, I'll probably point you in the direction of Addie or Jeff to help field those questions. And likewise, maybe it's St. Mary's River, in which case Neil will be able to jump in on that. I also see we have a lot of our research staff joining us today. So welcome DNR research section staff. And again, we can unmute you if a question comes up about some of our lake basin information. So with that as a preface, I say we go ahead and jump into the 2021 fishing guide. So again, as I mentioned, these are available online. They're still printed copies, but any of the updates will appear in the guide. And this will not necessarily come up today, but I will say more and more we're looking to be flexible and be able to adapt to the regulations, in which case at times we will make changes to the fishing guide in season, and those will be posted or noted on our online guide. If you fish Lake Erie or even Saginaw Bay for that matter, you'll notice there's a reference in one of the notes on the tables that specifies exactly what I'm saying, that there might be some updates to the regulations. Please view the online guide to see updated regulations. Most of the changes we're going to talk about today, if you want to go to the next slide, will actually kind of be viewed at looking at the next fishing season. So we're really thinking about 2022. We do this intentionally because we want ample time for all stakeholders to be able to weigh in on different regulations, whether it be a statewide proposal like one we're going to talk about today, or a lake-specific exemption such as a pike limit on an individual lake. So again, this is just to remind you, if you've got questions, I see there are some comments in the chat, and most of those are some references to the guide. I see a question on smelt, and maybe we'll come back to some of those as we kind of work through those. And I'm going to get a lot of help today to try to make sure that those questions are answered at the right time. So why don't we go ahead and just jump into the first proposal, the statewide proposal. This was a proposal that was brought to the NRC by the Michigan Spearfishing Association in April of 2019. The NRC directed the Spearfishing Association to work with the DNR on a proposed amendment to Fish Order 219. And this included a timeline that has this step in particular, where we bring this to each of the conversations and coffee across the state, because it is a statewide regulation. And even though we're talking about Lake Huron today, or Lake Huron Basin, both inland and the Michigan waters, Lake Huron, we're going to be talking about this proposal, but it'll be brought up in the other conversations and coffees as well. So we'll have multiple ways to provide feedback on this. And I'm going to kind of summarize that after I get through a couple of the info slides on this. Just to kind of put this in a timeline, depending on the comments, this could be presented in the fall of this year back to the NRC, which again would mean it wouldn't be effective. Any changes wouldn't be effective until April of 2022. Now, the next slide kind of shows you that we're not talking about making spearfishing legal or illegal in Michigan. It is already a legal activity. It's allowed with certain restrictions. So spring or rubber propelled spear guns attached to a line not exceeding 20 feet in length also is allowed, and the majority of species that are covered under the spearfishing are what you would normally consider more of the rough species. In addition to that, there's already prohibitions on not using scuba or other rebreather devices that would increase the effectiveness, and safety precautions such as designated swimming areas or other areas would be protected, keeping the activities away from conflict of somebody trying to launch a boat or a navigation channel, etc. So it follows a lot of the similar regulations with scuba diving in terms of the diver down flag. So these are already allowed. So what's being proposed? What's being proposed, if you look at the next slide, is basically to expand some of the opportunities in Great Lakes waters only. And this would be for additional species. In the proposal included northern pike, lake trout, and walleye, and also a season of Saturday in April through September 30th. There were a number of questions that came up when the proposals were vetted with the DNR in terms of maybe some specifics, but for the most part, the existing minimum size and possession limits would still apply across this proposal. So that's what's being talked about. And what I can tell you is some of the questions I saw in the chat, and also with the participants when they submitted this or registered, was some support for the spearfishing activity is another opportunity for Michigan anglers. So some of you mentioned that. There was some support also for expanding the species based on the comments of the registration, mainly in the sense that they believe that this free diving would really limit the any of the biological concerns as well. So what we'll do is we'll kind of, unless there's questions, Megan or Brandon specifically about this, I want to point out that at the end of this, you'll be sent a survey. So if you don't want to voice your concern today about this proposal, you'll have a chance in the end to be able to respond in terms of your concerns, support, or opposition to this proposal. All right, with that, I guess I'd like to kind of move into the next statewide issue. And this isn't a regulatory proposal per se, but more an awareness that kind of came out of both workshops, the offshore and the nearshore workshop. And it's this new permit system that's going to help us in our management of the conflicts between double-crested cormorants and fisheries. So one of the questions that was brought up in the chat was, what's being done to control cormorants? And this new permit system, there's a lot of detail behind it and a lot of work that led up to it. And so I've asked Jared Duquette, the new chief of Michigan Department of Natural Resources Wildlife Division, to join us today. So I'm really pleased to have you here, Jared, and to kind of ask you if you can kind of describe wildlife's role in facilitating this new permit system for cormorant control and management.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Randy. Yeah, and that's a great question. Let me address that as part of my explanation here of this permit system. So recently, the Fish and Wildlife Service, of course, who oversees cormorants because they're a migratory bird, they have a new electronic system we had to apply for, which is a little bit tricky. And one of the people in my division in wildlife worked us through that system, worked with Randy and developing that partnership, but also allow us to still maintain sub-permittees on through that system as well, which would include being able to sub-permit such agencies like USDA Wildlife Services, who's partnering with us this year and will continue to, but also looking to extend what we do with or historically have done with our volunteers as well with this program. This year, our hands are tied, even with our own volunteers for habitat management and all these other things we want to do with COVID and restrictions. So we didn't have time to push that through in time to get our public volunteers ready, but it's something that's on our radar now for next year and gearing up to get folks around and having those conversations of looking at where do we need to look at control, whether that's harassment or lethal control with wildlife services, but also, where do we want to begin starting to pilot test again using volunteers to help with, counting nests, doing harassment, and lethal control where needed and where plausible there. So we're working through that right now. The permitting is going, I think, pretty smoothly. And Randy, I don't think I've heard too many bugs from the fisheries side with the permitting either so far.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Jared. I know we were one of the first states through the system. We received an allocation of over 10,000 birds potentially for lethal control. But one of the things I noticed about this year, being a new permit system, is really the willingness of the different partners to sit down and try to come up with reasonable approaches. And one of the questions that was asked from a participant was, well, will we be able to exert control on some of the wildlife refuges such as Little Charity Island? And I don't know if you have seen this from the wildlife side, but I certainly have noticed the refuge folks are engaged in the conversation, as you mentioned, and the partners are really coming to the table to say, hey, let's work through this together. Are you seeing the same thing with your staff?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we're working through right now who's going to be serving point on this. We have some staff changes and retirements going on right now. So with wildlife, so it's not just cormorants. It's several things that we're excuse me, trying to work on as far as who's going to serve point on this or that. And cormorants is included in that. So I think we have a good team put together, and I think we're starting to have those discussions coming up here. Really solidifying what next year is going to look like here, and rallying people and bringing folks to the table here to do this. I did see in the permit the Fish and Wildlife Service has given us the clearance to work on Little Charity Island. So to address that question head on, we will be able to look at that. Just in the past, that's been tough, I know, because Wildlife Services only has a small crew and they have a lot of area to cover and a lot of different things that we've tasked them with. So that's been challenging. So, that's a great question and something we'll not only consider with, Charity Island, but all the areas that, we have issues with cormorants here.
Excellent. Well, Brandon or Megan, if I'm not seeing any more questions on cormorants, we can.
Yeah, Randy, no questions on cormorants at this point. I presume some of them may come in, but can we circle back quick to a couple questions on the spearfishing?
Absolutely. And thanks, Jared, for those comments.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jared. And so one of the questions was related to the regulatory consideration of what kind of testing might be required in order to properly identify size and species of fish. In other words, is there a test or something that would have to go with that for folks to identify fish that they're targeting?
Right. So, there would not be a test for an individual spearfisher, but the responsibility and the ownership would be on the angler, the spearfisher, to be able to both identify the fish, but also, again, the other regulations apply, right? So, not harvest an undersized fish, make sure that the species is identified. And I think, there's a lot of information about spearfishing and most of the people that I've talked to, they spend a lot of time in the water and they can identify a lot of these species. And I think they wouldn't be involved in this activity if they weren't so committed. But by chance that they make a mistake, they'd be held accountable as any other angler would in terms of harvesting a fish illegally or out of season or out of the current regulations.
Great, thanks. And that speaks, excuse me, speaks to some of the other questions and conversation in the chat, just talking about how you determine legal size fish from a distance underwater. And I think you addressed that well. And the only other chat that was, or comment, maybe more so, that was contributed was just the importance of diversifying the opportunity in spearfishing in terms of diversifying economic opportunities out of our Great Lakes fisheries. So with that, Sierra, did you see any other questions in the chat related to spearfishing or cormorants?
Nope, I believe you caught them all.
There was just one clarifying question about the use of scuba with spearfishing, and just wanted to clarify, when was scuba banned from spearfishing?
That's a question that we might have to follow up with the participant to find out when that regulation changed, but the current regulation, from what I understand, excludes scuba from spearfishing.
Okay, and I see Jonathan does have his hand raised, so I'm going to ask him to unmute because he might have some additional information.
Excellent.
Hello,
All right,
Jonathan.
can you guys hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
we can.
Perfect. Okay, so currently the regulations do not restrict scuba gear or rebreathing. The prohibition of this would be specific to this season with these new fish on the Great Lakes only. So during the full year-round season for all the rough fish, like Randy mentioned earlier, you could technically still use that. We're getting rid of the scuba gear for this new season for the lake trout, the walleye, and the pike. So if you are on the Great Lakes pursuing those species, you would not be allowed to use scuba gear.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that clarification.
Awesome. So let's move along and continue on to Northern Lake Huron.
All right, and let's turn it over to Dave Borgeson, Unit Manager, to kind of give the introductory comments on regulatory changes for Northern Lake Huron. Dave?
All right, thanks, Randy. As Randy mentioned, our unit has 2 biologists, each with a primary area of responsibility. Neil Godby has the area on the map shown here, shaded in yellow, which includes a large portion of the Eastern Upper Peninsula. And Tim Swolinski has the area shaded in pink, or as he prefers to refer to it, as salmon colored. The next slide, please. Yeah, the Northern Lake Huron Management Unit has some proposed regulation changes for 2022 that we'd love to get some of your feedback on. They mostly include small inland water bodies. If you participated in last year's conversations in coffee, you may recognize that some of these were proposed last year, but due to the craziness that was rampant last year, we were not able to implement. Some of the proposals from last year include removing the Trout Lake designation from Lake 15 and Castle Rock Pond because we are no longer stocking trout in those waters due to poor returns. Also proposed last year was to allow year-round fishing in Bright Lake. It's a small trout lake in Crawford County. And the idea here is to increase fishing opportunity. Next slide, please. Tim Swalinski also has a similar proposal this year for this coming year for Twin Lake #1 in Sheboygan County. Again, it's historically been a small trout lake. Tim is proposing to remove the trout designation on that lake because we've decided to cease stocking again due to poor returns of the stock fish. I think now I'll hand things over to Neil Godby, who has one proposal left over from last year, and a couple of new regulation changes proposals for next year that he'd like some input on. Neil?
Thanks, Dave. Next slide, please. So one lake or regulation that, as Dave pointed out, was proposed last year was not implemented. So we're now kicking it to 2022 is Wakely Lake in Crawford County. This is a popular walk-in lake with catch and release only fishing, quality fishing lake regulations. The current regulations are catch and immediate release only with artificial lures only, and it's currently open June 15th through August 31st. We're proposing to keep those same regulations, the exception of extending the open fishing season a little bit earlier and a little bit later from the last Saturday in April to September 30th. And the idea behind that is to increase fishing opportunity with a very low likelihood of harming the fish populations. Next slide, please. Jones Lake, this is one we are proposing for 2022 fishing season, a new proposal, one we're kicking around. The current regulations, similar to what Wakely Lake is catch and release only, artificial lures only, and a restricted open season from June 1st to September 30th. We are proposing to remove those restrictive regulations and make it go to the default statewide standard regulations where it's open all year and different gears and harvest are allowed. The rationale behind that is to increase angling opportunity, particularly with the associated campground that's adjacent to it right on the shore. We've had requests from campground managers as well as campers and lake users to do this, to allow some harvest of bluegill and bass. So we are making this proposal, but are really looking for feedback from the public on this. So if you've fished Jones Lake or have thoughts or ideas on it, please reach out to us. It would be appreciated. Next slide, please. Another proposal is to a change in pike fishing regulations on Crooked Lake in Emmett County. The proposal, or I'm sorry, currently it's the statewide standard regulation of 2 northern pike over 24 inches. We're proposing to change it to a more liberalized possession and size limit from northern pike to 5 northern pike of any size, only one greater than 24 inches. The idea is that there's a lot of small pike, stunted northern pike in there. This would help thin out that population, perhaps improve the growth, but allow anglers to harvest some of those small pike and perhaps benefit some other parts of the fish population and community. Next slide, please. And with that, I will kick it to Randy or Jeff.
Yep, Jeff Jolly, the unit manager for Southern Lake Huron. Jeff, why don't you go ahead and facilitate the changes in your unit?
Yep, will do. Thanks. Now we're on to the Southern Lake Huron Management Unit, and our 2 biologists are Eddie Dutton and Jason Gosto. Both are going to walk you through the proposed changes for our unit. Eddie covers the northern area in purple there, and Jason is a lot of the thumb and some of the southern areas. So we'll go to the next slide and we will let Addie take it away. Thank you.
All right, so mine are going to be short and sweet. I have 3 Northern Pike regulation changes, and they're all the exact same format. So all 3 of these lakes have the statewide standard Northern Pike regulation, which is, as Neil mentioned, 2 pike can be harvested per day, and they have to be 24 inches. And on all 3 of these lakes, the proposed change is to have a possession of 5 Northern Pike with only 1 fish that's greater than 24 inches. So the first here is Lake Lancelot, which is in Gladwin County, and is primarily a private lake proposed in 21, wasn't heard, and now is being proposed in 2022, connected to Lake Lancer, which already has this regulation. Next slide, please. The next is also in Gladwin County. This is Wiggins Lake, a reservoir that it has similar dynamics to these other lakes, abundant Northern Pike populations that are relatively small, having a hard time reaching the 24-inch minimum size limit, and this will allow for additional harvest opportunities. Next slide, please. And the final lake is Sage Lake, which is in Ogama County, another reservoir that has a high abundance of small, slow-growing Northern Pike, so increasing harvest opportunities while also still allowing the rest of the fish community to flourish. Next slide, please. And I will hand it over to Jason.
Thanks, Addie. Just one proposal here to cover briefly. This pertains to the upstream boundary for the gear restrictions in the Flint River. This was moved downstream to the Mott Dam for Mott Reservoir for the 2021 fishing season. And after further discussions with law enforcement division, we felt like it was worth moving that boundary back up to Holloway Dam, where it had been for a number of years due to the upstream migration of walleye out of Mott Reservoir. There's quite a bit of fishing pressure in this stretch of river. And so by implementing those gear restrictions again, we are allowing for angling opportunities, but limiting the probability of incidentally catching walleye as they are vulnerable while they are congregated below the dam. So that's the only proposal for my area.
Excellent. And really appreciate that, everybody. A few of the questions that have come up with the chat and why we're on the Southern Lake Huron, either Addie or Jeff, they're speaking to the impacts of the dam failures. I know it's been a substantial issue for us to kind of talk through those. We've had a lot of meetings and work with the Four Lakes Task Force, but you want to speak to the fisheries impacts, what you're seeing, both in terms of the loss of the reservoir fisheries, but then some changes in the river since then to kind of address the comments that were raised?
Yeah, I can make a couple comments about that. And the short answer is, you know, we don't have a lot of hard data, but we have a lot of observations and from our Creel clerks who are super valuable in feeding that info to us, as well as other sources. And so some of the changes that we've seen are, you know, first of all, one of the first things we were hearing about is the flow patterns of the river are a little different now downriver. That you know, was highly regulated by those dams, and that sort of controlled the flow. And a lot of people, you know, of course, fish the lower river for walleye. Now it's more, how it is today is more natural, as you know, it's sort of dictated by precipitation, climate, weather, and that's. I would certainly imagine that has a behavioral effect on the walleye, and that's going to force anglers to kind of change their tactics a little bit. I think, and you know, like this year right now, we kind of have a lack of flow or a lack of precipitation. That's probably affecting things. So that's an adjustment. Other questions that we had, you know, the one thing that we were real concerned with, at least I was, is that right below Dow Dam there in the Tittabawassee is one of the most important walleye spawning areas. And we were concerned about sediment and the flooding and all these sorts of things that may affect it. And, you know, we were up there a little bit last year, but we were there this spring to do our annual walleye tagging. And the habitat looks the same. It looks good. We didn't, you know, our crew that's got many years of experience doing this every single year didn't necessarily notice a huge difference in walleye numbers or things like that. So all that sort of suggests pretty, like that wasn't impacted really. And, you know, the other question is last year with the flood, what about the young of the year walleye that were in the river or maybe in the river? Well, our feeling is that most of those fish should have been kind of on their way out or out of the river by then. The walleye spawn in March, the fish hatch out, they hang out for a period of time, and so they work their way out. The floods happened in May. And so our feeling was a lot of those fish should have been pushed out and shouldn't have had a huge effect on it. So that's sort of some of my observations.
Thank you for sharing those observations, Jeff. And I would like to note that if you are joining by phone and you would like to ask a question, you can do that by, if you raise your hand, you can do that by hitting *9, and that'll let us know that you would like to ask a question, and then we can unmute you from there. So just wanted to make sure you knew if you're joining by phone and have a question to ask, just hit *9, and then we can unmute you.
And Addie, did you want to add anything about the muskie observations in the river post the dam failures tidbit?
Sure. I would say that from our initial surveys, which have been pretty short and sweet, but we've surveyed downstream of Sanford, we've seen very nice, healthy, abundant muskie populations. They're looking really good. And I think that is an indicator of decent survival from the dam failures, indicating that the fish are finding their homes downstream. So.
Excellent. Yep. Appreciate that summary. I know there's a question or two about the Saginaw River system, some of the regulations in Saginaw Bay. So Jeff, maybe be a good time to talk through, one of the benefits of these conversations in coffee is not only do we discuss or get feedback on some of the proposals, but we also kind of make people aware of different opportunities to provide input through either the Citizens Advisory Committee or, in this case, Jeff, the work group that you put together for Saginaw Bay and the river fishery. So you want to kind of speak to the work group, what you guys are doing and how that relates to regulation changes that may be coming or may not be coming in the future for the river or the bay?
Yeah, I'll try to keep this, I can kind of drone on this, and I'll try to keep it short so we have lots of time for other questions. Over the past year, we formed a citizen-based work group to consult with, to talk about the future management of the Saginaw Bay walleye population. And there's been various requests here and there, and those conversations sort of morphed into, let's take a step back and really do some visioning and talk about with our constituents, with the recreational fishers, what we want out of the bay, where we are now, what we like about it, how it could be even better, those sorts of things. And COVID stalled us out a little bit, but we eventually got it going in a virtual format and had a series of meetings throughout the fall. And sort of the last kind of pieces of that sort of citizen engagement, information gathering processes are some surveys that we've done, trying to capture all the values of the Saginaw Bay fishery. Eventually, opening the river fishery, having a closed season, having it open, lowering the bag limit, doing various things. These are all sort of things that have come up. And not surprisingly, there's a variety of opinions about those things. And so we're gonna finish collecting the input from our constituents, and then our team, the DNR team, we're gonna move forward in writing a sort of vision and management plan to carry us into the future, and something that has some sort of tangible scenarios in it that would trigger us to maybe consider some sort of management change or harvest change or whatever, and share that with Frank Christ and the citizens advisors that have been a huge part of this process, and then share that out further, and so in the future there could be some possible management changes. There might not be any. It might be the best thing to do is to leave the status quo as how we are right now. It's a very, very good fishery. it's very valued that all the citizens we've engaged with are very echo that. That's a special thing, and we don't want to do any damage to it. So that's kind of, there'll be more to come, and Megan has put up the sort of roadmap of our process there.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, one of the questions I see in the chat was about the importance of the shore fishing opportunities for those anglers. And that was definitely one of the comments I think that led into this work group, and it's carried forward in terms of providing a diverse set of opportunities, but also not putting risks to the populations that are managed. But there was an interesting suggestion of a harvest regulation just on males, allowing harvest of males only. And again, those kind of recommendations could be pulled in and vetted through the work group, and then considered as part of that overall process. So Jeff, thanks for mentioning that. I know there was a few questions also on kind of Lake Huron salmon and trout management. Some mention of coho. Some people want to know why we didn't stock brown trout anymore. And we can speak generally to that. I think overall, this is another one where we work closely with our Citizens Advisory Committee, and Frank Chris is on in the meeting as well, and he can tell me if I'm wrong or misspeak. But we listen to a lot of their input, sound proposals off them as well, and we did recently make a change to scale back some of the Chinook salmon stocking. So we could provide additional opportunities, including coho salmon. We've identified goals as both a diverse salmon and trout community and a diverse prey-based community to support that. And that includes Chinook, coho, steelhead, lake trout, and in a few instances, brown trout, but those are pretty limited. And we're excited about our Atlantic salmon fishery, excited about the coho fishery, but just speaking about it generally, we're balancing it and managing it with all the tools we have. So I don't know if that's too general to answer specific questions, but we can certainly ask more. I know I did see one proposal about having like a trolling license or additional opportunity to buy a license. That that's been mentioned, and I would encourage reps to work through MUCC or others on those, because those really become entirely a social regulation. And so, we are to some extent, our interaction with the NRC is mandated first based on biology and the resource. So we want to look at regulatory changes from their biological impact first, and then also include social impacts. But when it's almost entirely a social proposal, we'd like to see involvement of larger groups like MUCC in the development of those ideas, because they really should have a broad-based grassroots support before they come to us as a proposal. Any predictions on walleye populations in Thunder Bay or Alpena this season? I know I've seen some stakeholders on that are running up and down the coastline that might we be able to speak to. I think the walleye run was kind of early and different times and kind of over, but either Ed or Randy Tyrion or others that might be on there, you can correct me if I'm wrong in terms of what people are seeing with the walleye moving up the shoreline this year, if you want to. If not, put it in the chat, or we can. Dave, you hear anything, Borgeson, on your end in terms of the walleye migration? Is that pretty consistent with what I characterize there?
Well, I've heard reports of some of the walleye moving out of the rivers now, so they're not as thick as they were, but I'm not sure they were as prominent this year as in years past. And again, it would be if Ed could hit, was it star 9 to give his thoughts on this, because he's right there at the mouth. Or Tim, perhaps?
Yeah, this is Tim. I'm hearing basically that especially from Randy Tyrion, that the walleye numbers are down in the areas of Alpena and Oscoda. And, we kind of we look at that, we kind of get a gauge on that because we're also stocking trout and salmon at those ports. So, but in general, anglers are not catching a lot of walleye right now at those two sites. Doesn't mean there won't be migrant fish coming up from Saginaw Bay here soon, but right now the catches seem to be lower.
And Dave Fielder added on in the chat that it's a little early yet to judge the walleye migration up the coast from Saginaw Bay. It usually starts right about now and lasts through early June.
Good point. And with this spring so far, I think anything's on the table. But I will say, so thanks Dave Fielder for jumping in the chat on that comment. A couple of comments about the perch fishing and one in particular about the regulation changes. Our regulation changes oftentimes are difficult to link directly with changes in the fish populations. This could be from a variety of factors. Fisheries are often driven by recruitment dynamics, the number of small fish that are produced, and the fishery is just a product of that recruitment. What I will say is, a couple years ago, we changed the statewide regulation for yellow perch, reduced it from 50 to 25. And we've received a lot of positive comments over the last couple of years about that regulation change. And I'm encouraged to see in different areas of the state, including Saginaw Bay, where this regulation was kind of even a little ahead of its time. We're starting to see potentially some of those impacts where the perch populations are coming back. But, again, we can't link that directly to the regulations, and certainly some of the other things we're doing with walleye, the liberalized walleye regulation is trying to reach that balance. And we think we are getting there in terms of that overall Saginaw Bay yellow perch walleye dynamic. I know there's a series of questions both submitted by the participants, but even shown up now about commercial fishing and specifically the consent decree negotiations. I can't say much about both of those because they are in legal discussions and are ongoing. What I can say with the consent decree is the Great Lakes 2000 consent decree did expire in August of 2020. There has been court orders to extend that agreement. So all the provisions in the 2000 consent decree continue as is until either a new agreement is reached or the parties enter into court. So that's where we're at right now in the process. The parties are still trying to work through a renegotiated 2000 consent decree. And, once we hear more about that, we'll be able to roll out that information to you. And I think there were some questions about Saginaw Bay and the commercial fishery. And again, I think if you look back to the Nearshore Fisheries Workshop recordings, there's a lot of detail in there about the walleye and perch populations, but also the sources of mortality in terms of yellow perch and the recreational commercial fisheries. So again, the fishing mortality isn't really what's regulating those populations, but I encourage you to look back to those presentations in terms of the biological impact of the two different mortality sources, and hopefully that'll educate or address some of the questions out there. Brandon,
and that video
Megan,
should be ready by tomorrow. So
love it.
Be sure to tune into our Michigan Sea Grant YouTube page, and we'll also share that link out with everyone.
So Friday night movie, get your popcorn. There you go.
Right. Great. Randy, you're on a roll. There are a few extra questions regarding muskie. If you want to go in that direction, there's also just a question broadly asking to know a bit more about the bass fishery.
Yeah, and the muskie questions, you'll have to be more specific. I didn't catch up on them. So, and Addie and Tim would probably be good to address those if, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, let me ask those two questions and then you can respond. So the first is, I think there was a Cook Dam Pond spring survey planned, maybe even targeted to evaluate muskies. How did that go, or is it still going? And then will any of the Tittabawassee spawning marshes be operated for muskie spring fingerling production? They should be.
So this is Tim. I did, Duke, respond in detail in the chat on the Cook Pond question. We didn't see any muskie. Monday night when we were there. I was on the boat, but we were really doing some exploring to see between Five Channels Dam and Cook Pond proper, where there's some river channel current and a little bit of vegetation, if there was suitable areas to find the fish in those pinch points up above the impoundment. So we didn't find any. We found a fair number of walleye and smallmouth, but it kind of pushed me into future stocking efforts being for muskie, being directed more upstream, not down by Cook Pond Dam, but more up by Five Channels Dam. So we don't have a great feel for how much these Great Lakes strain muskie, number one, survive, but two, move out of the systems downstream, basically through the dam. So still a big learning curve there.
As for Tittabawassee spawning marshes, I would say I like the idea, and we had pre-dam failures, we had Secord planned for this year to get muskie in. Obviously with water level issues, and then also Duke finding a way to adequately get the muskie as a source. So we'd either have to stock them in as fingerlings because we couldn't run it as a traditional, like we had with the Northern Pike. We couldn't run it with muskie given the water levels in the two impoundments and two former impoundments. But I think it's a good idea. I mean, most of the infrastructure is there, so could be talked about. Just have to have a destination for the fish and a way to get them in and out.
Excellent. And I notice a couple questions. One, I want to circle back to Jason Gasto. Just Jason, did I cover the perch dynamics well enough in your region? Do you have anything to add on that?
Just briefly, Randy, I'll just talk about it. I know that one of the things that I want folks to remember or be aware of in relation to perch and walleye in Saginaw Bay is, a handful of years ago, when we went with the more liberalized regulation, the objective was to improve the yellow perch population through reducing the abundance of walleye. That was the management lever we pulled. And so now if we see some indicators of more yellow perch abundance, evidence of more throwbacks. I've heard of folks through the winter and into the spring having more small perch that they've caught. That's a good sign, right? That's sort of the goal that we are headed towards. So I just want folks to remember that the discussions maybe about reduced abundance of walleye in Saginaw Bay isn't cause for concern. It's sort of what we are aiming for. And so we're continuing to monitor that and hopefully move in that direction in a sense of still continuing to improve yellow perch. And I don't mean that in the sense of decimating walleye, right? We're trying to find a good balance between both.
Yeah, appreciate that follow-up, Jason. I know, and again, these conversations in coffee are aimed at trying to have those regulations linked with the goals and meet our objectives. And not only are the development of the regulatory proposals really useful in these conversations, but also the evaluation of them. What are people seeing the effect, on the end of the regulation scheme? So appreciate all the feedback from everyone. I know there's a question about lake trout management and specifically about stocking, but also lake trout. We've had to change regulations in terms of those populations as well. We still stock lake trout in northern Lake Huron. The changes that were made or that I reference potentially were actually in mid to southern Lake Huron, where lake trout stocking was canceled a few years back, primarily because of the increased natural reproduction of lake trout in Lake Huron. So we observed wild production. So we scaled back some of the stocking. Lake-wide, it was about a 60% reduction across Lake Huron. Now there's been some question about should stocking resume in southern Lake Huron because of the impacts of those stocking cuts in the fisheries, but there hasn't been a large scale change especially in the very far northern end of the lake, MH1, in terms of the stocking of lake trout, nor do we foresee any changes in stocking in the near future for lake trout. Probably regulatory changes, same thing. We're not foreseeing any changes. We're harvesting right near our quota, and as long as things stay constant, we should be good there as well. See if there's additional questions. And Megan or Brandon, how are we doing in terms of either hands being raised or questions that might need to address?
We have lots of questions. We won't probably get to them all, but you're doing a great job.
We definitely are. And before we pause for that next question, I just wanted to thank everyone. We are getting close to 7 o'clock. It's 6:59. So I did want to add that I know many people have supported different proposals in the chat, and with the Qualtrics form that Cindy will be dropping in the chat, you can share more thoughts on this meeting and the proposed regulation changes. And we will also be sharing this form with everyone following the meeting as well. So you are welcome to complete that form, and then we can continue to have questions following the meeting, but just wanted to make sure that if people needed to leave at 7, they had that. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. And again, I'll stick around for sure. And I know some of the staff will be able to as well. But I really want to thank, Michigan Sea Grant for facilitating this, and also Jared for joining us on the discussion of cormorants. And without a lot of questions today, I think people are feeling comfortable about the direction we're heading. And I'm sure we'll have more information to go and more information to share in the future. So thanks, Jared, for that. And I guess we can just continue along with the questions unless others want to jump in. Raise your hand.
Great. So I'll throw some at you. There's a lot of great questions just broadly about monitoring of populations of different species. So again, I'm just going to reiterate, it's been said a couple of times this evening that a lot of that was covered in the previous 2 Thursdays worth of talks. And so we'll direct you to those to definitely learn more. One ecological question that we didn't really touch on was really the study and understanding of the impacts of PFAS on Lake Huron fisheries.
Yeah, and I know that we can probably share. There's a lot of resources online, the state website for PFAS and PFOA and the threats of those contaminants in fish. So if you're looking at specific water bodies or specific concerns, I encourage you to go to that site and utilize those resources. They're fantastic. One of the things we are hearing, and this came out from the Wisconsin DNR, is finding of PFAS in smelt populations on the western end of Lake Superior. There were additional collections made in Lake Huron and across Michigan actually to look at those. But what's interesting about PFAS and PFOA and some of the theories behind that group of contaminants in fish is that we often think about contaminants bioaccumulating. So mercury and heavy metals basically accumulating in fish as you move up the food chain, with predators being the hottest in terms of those kind of suite of contaminants. Whereas the PFAS and PFOA tend to be more water soluble. And that's why we believe they're occurring in smaller fishes with more surface body ratios and in hot spots where these contaminants might be released into the water, they're showing up in species like smelt. So an interesting different mechanism, but for the most part in Lake Huron, again, you can look, we monitor it and we're not seeing those levels in smelt that were indicated in Western Lake Superior, but a lot of monitoring going on, and we're looking and taking those serious. So please feel free to reach out to those resources as well. I know there was some questions about clipping. I know in one of the registrations, somebody wanted to know about the Clinton River. I'm assuming the Clinton River, that flows into Lake St. Clair, and they're seeing maybe some salmon runs and some clipped fish, which is interesting where those fish might be coming. So I'm going to take just an opportunity to put a plug in, even if those are outside of Lake Huron Basin. We put a lot of time and money into our fish stocking efforts, and it's another major management lever. And one of the things that we're committed to is trying to evaluate the success of those. So in the opportunities that we have for species like Chinook salmon, Atlantic salmon, steelhead, lake trout, you'll notice if you catch one of those, it might be missing an adipose fin. And that's an indication to you that we really would like some information on that fish. It potentially contains a coated wire tag in its snout, and that coated wire tag will give us everything from age class, stocking year, the facility that the fish was reared in. So please, if you are out on Lake Huron streams or the lake proper and you catch a fish with an adipose fin clip, there's a lot of resources online for drop-off centers. You can contact anyone on the phone today in terms of the DNR fisheries staff, and we'll get you the resources so you can turn that head in or that snout, and we can get the data. And I believe I should also put a plug into the Great Lakes Salmon Initiative and some of the other stakeholders that have contributed a drawing last year, and this year they're continuing it. If you turn in a coated wire tag head in 2021, they'll do a random drawing, and there's $100 prizes handed out to anglers that are randomly drawn for that.
Awesome. On the topic of community science, if you're into helping contribute data, there was a talk two weeks ago on the Michigan Lake Huron Predator Diet Study being led by the MSU Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, among other partners. So you can turn in the snout and turn in the stomach to a different set of researchers and get lots of research mileage out of those fish. I did have, let's see, I think in terms of species, there's still an open question about just broadly how are bass doing. And then there was a question about smelt. I've heard that smelt are spawning offshore rather than in streams. Any comment? And I see, Tim, you did provide an answer for that. Did you want to share out loud?
Yeah, I think Stephen asked something about smelt. They're broadcast spawners, meaning they just gather in large numbers and let the eggs and melt go kind of over a variety of habitats. It just doesn't have to be in a river. It can be along shoals in the Great Lakes too, rocky areas, so sandy areas. So yes, they can spawn in both habitats.
And then I just wanted to circle back to a question that was answered earlier in the chat related to the spearfishing proposal, and just wanted to clarify that that proposal is specific to the Great Lakes and would not include any channels. So just wanted to be clear on that. There was a question about that. So just, it's a Great Lakes specific proposal.
Thanks, Megan. And Randy, you addressed a lot of the commercial fishing questions that came in, but on the topic of clarifying regulations, there was a few comments or questions about the Drummond netting going on in the Drummond Island area. And the question was specifically what species are being targeted there.
Yeah, and I would have to assume, Brandon, that those are likely nets that are part of the 1836 tribal governments or tribes sovereign to the 1836 agreement. So if they are truly tribal nets, then it would kind of follow their guide and restrictions. In most cases, the primary species is lake whitefish. However, in some cases, in certain areas, depths, or seasons, they can fish gill nets as part of their fishery. Also with a subsistence fishery, they can fish gill nets as well. So, I would say my recommendations of folks, when you look at either the treaty ceded waters or even outside of the treaty ceded waters of Lake Superior, Huron, and Michigan, if you see some suspicious buoys or net markings that don't make sense to you, or you're curious about please call the RAP line, call our law enforcement division folks. They like to know where these are located. They have maps in different locations that they're monitoring. And if they get several reports of potentially abandoned nets or other issues, they like to try to address those. So hard to speak to them after the fact, but my guess is they're Native American or tribal fishing gill nets and regulated under the 2000 consent decree. But again, feel free to reach out to our RAP line in case you notice something when you're out there in the water.
Yeah, and Randy, some of the locations they were speaking to that north of Drummond Island, there's the Canadian line runs pretty close there. So there's also some First Nation commercial activity in there. And we know that some walleye have been harvested by the Canadian First Nations in that area as well.
Great point.
Awesome. Couple more, maybe. Megan, or Randy, you can turn us off whenever. But my job was to throw questions, so I'll keep them coming until you tell me to stop. So one was just broadly thinking about whitefish and knowing that they've been taking a beating in the last few years. Is there anything being done or anything that's known to work to help whitefish recruitment in Lake Huron?
Yeah, I'm actually glad that question came up because I noticed too in the participant questions, some concern or questions about just the whole nutrient dynamics, mussels and food web disruption that we've seen across the Great Lakes, but really exemplified or magnified in Lake Huron. With regards to lake whitefish, they're kind of a collateral damage to those nutrient changes that zebra quagga mussels caused. So in terms of regulating the fishery, the changes happened so dramatically. And I know any of us that were out on Lake Huron could see those changes in the water clarity happen in the course of just a few years. And the drops in recruitment of lake whitefish, pretty much followed a decline in the fishery that's been going on for about 10 years now to now we're at record low levels of commercial yield. And this is all waters of Lake Huron, including the Canadian fisheries. So it's not just a Michigan or a consent decree tribal issue either. So, what can we do? Managers are pretty limited in their ability to try to address this directly. There is some discussions about not only changing some of the regulations, but the fishery's kind of been self-regulating. A lot of the fishers have either dropped out or reduced their gear because it just isn't worth time and effort in some places to try to commercially harvest like whitefish. But even so, I think the managers are very concerned that we need to do more. And how to address this mussel impact on the food web dynamics is a tough one, but one that I know a lot of people are looking at, and hopefully we'll come up with some innovative solutions in terms of either regulating mussels or helping promote a balance in terms of their impacts in native fish like whitefish.
Thanks, Randy. So I think we'll maybe round out the evening with this last question. We'll turn our attention to Atlantic salmon. So one of the silver linings among all of that ecosystem change you just described was Atlantic salmon and the investment in the Atlantic salmon program on Lake Huron. So the question is just wondering if there's still no or little natural reproduction of Atlantics in Lake Huron tributaries, and is there any reason to hope that they might someday reproduce on their own, I presume?
Sure. I think the idea behind Atlantic salmon right now is because the fish that are stocked in Lake Huron, 100% of them are clipped. And the only time that didn't happen was last year where we AD clipped the fish, but weren't able to get coda wire tags in all of them, nor were we able to clip all of them. So, a little bit of a gap in the data just because of COVID, but for the most part, we have a really good handle on not only how well each individual stocking is doing, but also what the overall sense of natural reproduction is. And it is low, and it's low for a lot of reasons that other salmonines in the Great Lakes have struggled, both from thiamine deficiencies, but also just in habitat quality and the ability of fish to successfully return in rivers and spawn. From a manager's standpoint, we'd like to see natural reproduction, but natural reproduction can also cause management issues. And you look at some of the changes with Chinook salmon in the early 2000s, and natural reproduction swung so quickly that we actually weren't able to adjust our stocking rates fast enough relative to the food web changes. So promoting natural reproduction and sustainable fisheries is a great goal, but I think if it doesn't occur, that's okay, and actually allows us from a management standpoint to deal with some of these really rapid, huge changes in the ecosystem in Lake Huron by adjusting stocking levels strategically. And so not having natural reproduction in this case is not necessarily the end of the world. And I think the Atlantic salmon fishery, you said silver lining, and they having that silver fishery build a little bit with a predator that's more diverse in their diet and is fun to catch is a great addition to Lake Huron.
Well, thanks.
Megan, and did we cover everything today that?
Yes, I think we did. And I think this is a great opportunity to wrap up this session and tell everyone thanks for coming and talking fish with all of us. We hope you enjoyed tonight's conversations and coffee. And if you want to talk fish more, I wanted to highlight some of our DNR partners here in case you would like to reach out and have further conversation. So just want to thank everyone again for joining us for tonight's conversations and coffee.